If you were to design a game, what do you consider the absolute most important thing to get right? The things you use to win, or the things you fight against? Let me simplify. In Plants vs Zombies, are the plants more important to get right, or are the zombies? Because I'm personally not all too sure. Usually, I'd go straight for zombies, and in general it's what I personally focus on. At the end of the day, the zombies define the stage, so a bad zombie is far more liable to ruin stages, and a good zombie is far more likely to make a stage more interesting. On the other hand though, unique plants can fundamentally change how you approach a stage and its zombies. It's hard to argue that a magnifying glass strategy interacts with a stage the same way a strategy centralizing around, say, Bloomerang would. And furthermore, players gain an attachment of sorts to the towers they use traditionally. I certainly associate something like, say, Bong Choi to PVZ2, over something like Prospector Zombie. With that being said, I do think there is something to be said for PVZ2's slow decline of his plants. As with most things in this game, over time, things become worse and worse. And while PVZ2 stopped making worlds almost a decade ago, it never stopped releasing plants. Ever. And thus, I consider these a great measuring stick to show the decline of the game as a whole, and show how the plants themselves fell from greatness. So, for the sake of this video, I'm splitting these plants into 4 eras. And thus, we shall start where it all began. The originals. The first era, for the context of this video, is Ancient Egypt, Pirate Seas, Wild West, Far Future, Dark Ages, and Big Wave Beach. Most plants here are actually just ports from PVZ1, and most of the new plants here actually just come from Big Wave Beach and Far Future. Here you also just generally get more plants. It wasn't until Dark Ages when the current staple of 5 plants per world was set, with up to Far Future having anywhere from 7 to 8 of them. And these plants are, generally, pretty great. Pretty much every single plant is useful in its own world here, and work to counter something in particular. Snapdragon is there to counter Swashbuckler and other zombie swarms. Iceberg-less is in Ancient Egypt to counter Explorer. Lightning Reed is in Wild West to counter Chicken Wrangler. Banana Launcher is in Big Wave Beach to counter Octos and Fishermen. There is always a clear and understandable reason for a plant being in its world, which means these plants all add to the experience of playing each world, rather than simply being unlocked in one. The biggest flaw here is the over-reliance on the PVZ1 cast, to tell you the truth. It is a bit jarring going to such exotic locations filled with zombies that thoroughly use the world's iconography to become interesting and unique threats that rarely touch on things that PVZ1 zombies did. But even when they do things in their own way, in a unique and flashy way. Then you unlock Repeater in Ancient Egypt. But in terms of how they work together, I'd say most plants are impactful additions to the core kit. All of these plants have simple designs that have a clear use case. Magnifying Grass is a plant that can turn sun into damage, albeit with a lot of inefficiency. Puffshroom is a free plant for early game that falls off late game. Plants like Coconut Cannon and Banana Launcher give you big endgame potential, though remain manual to ensure late game can remain interesting. And then you get Bowling Bulb, a plant that is utterly wacky and straight up encourages unique and fun playstyles. The premiums are also notable here. One thing to remember with premium plants is their goal. At least for the time being, the goal for premiums is for them to not be too powerful, but rather be interesting plants people would want to buy because it's fun, not because they break the game in half. They also generally serve to patch up the holes in the plant lineup here. Plants like Snow Pea give you an early game staller, and plants like Squash, Jalapeno, and Ghost Pepper help expand the instant plant lineup. Though, I will note that these plants are overly focused on being PVZ1 plants that people liked. Like, there is really no good reason otherwise for plants like Snow Pea, Squash, or even Chomper being premium. And the new ones here include Homing Thistle, which is just cattail, Peanut, which is just bad, with only Ghost Pepper, Sweet Potato, and Power Lily standing out. And 2 of those free are limited time only. It's a little rough on this front. Though I think this set of plants are overall the strongest in the game. These plants are core and fundamental to all decks. You'd be hard pressed to build a variety of good decks without dipping into at least a few of these plants, and these are thoroughly iconic plants. I'd argue plants like bok choy, snapdragon, and lightning reed are the first plants you think of when people talk about PVZ2. I think that says a lot about them, and how neatly they fit into the PVZ game loop. However, as all things do, eras come to an end. And the end of this one is a little world some may recall as being called Lost City, because things change significantly from here. This era covers the rest of the worlds in PVZ2. So, Frostbite Caves, Lost City, the Mixtape Tour, Jurassic Marsh, and Modern Day. While we technically do start with Frostbite Caves, that's more of a transitionary world. Its plant design is closer to the originals, but it's been clumped up for a very important reason, and one I talked about in a past video. From Frostbite Caves onwards, you are going to see plant cost variety plummet. No plant in any of these worlds costs more than 200, with only Pepperpult itself costing 200. While I did certainly say that the previous set of plants were core and that was good, a lot of the reason they are core is that none of these plants have weight to them. All these plants are way too light for their own good, as now there is a ton of competition at lower sun costs, but absolutely none at the higher set. Now, it's not all bad, as some plants here are still very major to the game as a whole. Chardguard, Stolier, and Stunyon are fundamental to the stalling side of PVZ2. Pretty much all of the primal plants are mechanically strong and interesting, albeit less interesting than they could be conceptually. And the shadow plants are a neat gimmick, but there's much more plants that flounder in these worlds, and even more plants that only have usage in their home worlds. Goldleaf, Fine Warp, Hot Potato, Perfume Shroom. And don't get it twisted, Big Wave Beach had this too, but all the plants in that world made up for the fact they were technically 2 plants down by being some of the best in the entire game. Lost City, meanwhile, has a retread of Repeater, Bloomerang, and Walnut for its core plants. It ain't good. And don't get me started on the Mixtape Tour. In the only world of this set with 6 plants in it, they've managed to only include a single actually useful plant. Seriously. Fat Beat deals no damage and is hard counted by its own world. Golok has the absolute worst stats known to man. Spore Shroom is terrible in a world with the biggest SO speedy bucketheads, and is countered by one of 1,000 instant kills, and Intensive Carrot is here. It's just rough. However, as much as I have issues with some of these plants, there is still a lot of effort being put into them, don't forget that. These worlds are just where the dev cycle started catching up. Remember, the first few worlds were designed before the game released, and they evidently had much more time to work on them than any other part of the game. Meanwhile, the dev cycle for future worlds would only become shorter and shorter. Like, by the end of 2014, they added 3 worlds up to Big Wave Beach. By the end of 2015, they added worlds up to Jurassic Marsh, meaning they added a new world every 2 months. Though, even still, these are mostly entirely new plants, and that's commendable in its own right. Every plant needed to be sketched, designed, and animated with no reference footage from PVZ1, slowly over time slotting in what they could scrape together in time. I would not be surprised if quite a few of these plants ended up in the wrong spots as a result. And while I think the majority is weak, there are some gems in the rough. Celery Stalk is incredibly fun to use. The Shadow system, as weird as inclusion as I find them, is not a bad system and really are fun, especially considering how limited time was put into them. And most of Frostbite Cave's plants are actually good, but the lack of heavy plants means that they only affect your strategy to a point. But when they do affect it, they add more variety to a game that thrives on it. Don't let my whining deceive you, these plants are improvements to the game. The premiums, though, also do show the general trends going down. Toadstool being just a power crop chomper, Cactus being just a better bloomerang. While heavy premiums did exist, only Dandelion and Strawburst actually hit out of the above 200% threshold, and the latter is best described as a finicky coconut cannon. In addition, we have clearly hit past the point of premiums originally meant to be just interesting plants, as we now have a massive amount of plants who aim to just strictly power creep other plants. What joy. But still, these are a good set of plants. They could be better, but I think they are more than fine, and don't actively hinder the game. Unfortunately though, the era of PVZ2 is about to end, and we're heading into the real problems, because we're on a collision course with modern PVZ. Here, we see a major shift in the design philosophy for PVZ2's plants. Before, plants kinda needed to be good in the worlds they were assigned to. Even premiums, who were obviously not unlocked in their home worlds, are still based on the sections of the world they were assigned to. Toadstool is still a Lost City plant after all. Very few plants in PVZ2 before existed outside of his realm, mostly coming down to just the holiday plants. In addition, the upload schedule changed. Before, you'd have 7 plants made every 2 months. Now, well, you only made 2. This dramatically shifted how plants had to be designed, and how much time you had to design them. And from the start, you were already feeling this. This era mostly covers the remaining premium and the new Epic Quest plants, and the first bunch of Cediums. And mints, I guess. The mints are interesting because they were an obvious attempt to include a form of elemental system into the game, both allowing more plants to be made, while also being something to make Arena's inclusion make any sense. But they don't really get used all too much, and the plant family system is something I often entirely forget about. Buffs and bruises are kinda exclusive to the Arena and Penny's Pursuit, but I really have no further knowledge of these. The mints themselves are also, really, the only way these families even have a real effect on each other, rendering this whole massive set of changes extremely mute. This is pretty representative of how these plants actually work. Often too complicated for their own good, are so powerful that the game has to actually nerf them to the ground during certain days to get them out of the field for even the briefest period. When people talk about Power Cream PVZ2, this is the era which ramped it up to 11. Leveling is now a thing, so these plants are no longer designed to compete with your base game plants. They have to be able to compete with upgraded plants, which results in silly stats or mechanics that are fundamentally ridiculous. And that's not even the worst part. See, there's only so many plants that can be added, because you can't tread on what's come before, as these plants are the selling point. These plants require a lot of grinding or actual money to get, so you need to make sure they are worth it. And because power is now a valuable resource in of itself again, due to the new modes that scale infinitely as the players fight them, you can't just make every plant broken. Instead, plants now have to get weird in order to survive. It started off pretty simple for Arena. A plant that pierces armor is a bit strong, but isn't too far out of realm possibility, and was handled pretty well. A plant that summons zombies is a novel concept that hasn't been seen before, and is fun to screw around with. A soul that stalls better as it grows, sure. But even here, you're starting to see random trace after the plants with no rhyme or reason. Why does electricity attack zombies around it for exactly 3 damage? Why does Shadow hide when zombies get too close? Why does Impair exist, just in general? And occasionally you get these insanely overpowered plants. Pokra, Gumnut, Explodio Nut, and Vine. Plants were starting to gain random abilities now. They were starting to become strange, and slowly, but surely, they were starting to mutate. You might be wondering where this era starts. I'm not sure myself. All I can say is that you look at the newest plants, and I don't need to tell you that there is something thoroughly wrong here. Plants no longer even look the part. They no longer look like plants. Their abilities only becoming more and more complex as time goes on. I cannot explain to you what maybe does. I cannot explain to you why Sundew Tangler has no goddamn shadow. And frankly, I don't know why Godshroom is an eldritch entity from beyond the realms we stand on. The thing is that, without new zombies to work with, these plants lack a purpose. They lack something to counter. It should be clear in looking back that these plants became weird because they have nothing new to work with. It should be no surprise that only now are we getting the return of PVZ1 plants. Plants excluded from the original game for obvious and clear reasons, now only back because what else can they do? They don't even often do what they originally did, and some are utterly nonsensical. Why the actual hell was Seashroom added? Why did they add Ice Shroom but as a melee plant? Of course, that's not to say no plant has absolutely no interesting ideas, but they are trapped behind so much nonsense it's hard to drag them out. Take Frost Bonnet for instance. It's a plant that can swap between a chilling and fire damage mode, but it's a melee plant for some reason. And the fire damage mode actually does less damage for a slightly higher fire rate. And its fire deals double damage to chill targets. And its ice has a chance to ice block zombies when they are killed. Do you see what I mean? While the concept of a mixed attacker can work, and some of these are fine ideas, they just don't mesh well into a consistent attacker. There's so much random nonsense that just doesn't need to be here. Just make its chill damage low and its fire damage high. None of the other effects need to be here. And trust me, this is just a single example. Why does Bramblebush, a plant that can stall single zombies indefinitely, destroy armor instantly? Why does Butterboom, a heavy explosive plant that stalls with survivors, randomly fling butter all around the screen? Why does Doomshroom need time to grow to max size? Why does Tomb Tangler? Why does Beansprout, a melee plant that needs to be damaged to grow, have this strange stipulation reverting back to normal after a set amount of time? Well, the answer for all these is pretty simple. Because these plants need to be different from what came before. They have to be. And thus, they mutate new traits out of nowhere. Traits that do not help, or actively go against what they aim to do. And now, we have plants that no longer work. To tell you the truth though, it's hard to argue that it is really anyone's fault here. PVZ2 is ran by a skeleton crew, who cannot reasonably be expected to continue with a higher quality standards of what came before. And truthfully, PVZ2 shouldn't be updated anymore. Game's old, it's ran its course well and truly. But PVZ2 is probably the only thing in the PVZ franchise that's actually keeping it afloat, as PVZ3 got taken down again to have yet more changes made to it. So, you know, things like this just kinda happen. And at the end of the day, these plants do not make the game worse alone. They are just a symptom of PVZ2's current state. So what did we learn from this little exercise? Absolutely nothing of note. Look, PVZ2's mon state being bad is the opposite of a shock, and it's something that you can legitimately just look at the footage and notice. Like, they changed the fonts. The game is not exactly at its peak state. But that's not to say there's nothing to note here. I'd argue that, if nothing else, this shows how perfection in all things isn't necessary to create a good or even great game. Like, I consider plant design to drop off a cliff after Big Wave Beach and Frostbite Caves, yet that doesn't mean I consider worlds after pointless or worthless. Those worlds still contribute interesting gameplay, and each of them still expands the core gameplay variety. At the end of the day, a game is greater than the sum of its parts, and when some features may fail or struggle, other features can succeed beyond question. With that being said, thanks for watching. This video has been a little bit of a nightmare to get out because of a million things happening, so I've literally had this script done and recorded for at least 3 weeks at this point. I will never get an upload schedule. The universe has deemed it impossible, it seems. Like, this was meant to be an April Fool's Day video. Looks like I was the April Fool. But my whining is ultimately beyond pointless, so I should just get to the finale, eh? This has been Creeps, and have a good one.